Hello everyone, this is Chapter 1 Presentations. In this managerial economic course, we're going to learn a few technical skills by using some economic tools to solve some business problems as a decision maker of the firms or maybe the manager of a company. In this chapter, we're going to briefly go over some of the common problems that we might face and break it down into some economic concepts so that we can actually figure out how we are solving those problems in the with economic intuitions. The textbook covers several sections, and in this PowerPoint slide, we're going to mainly focus on a few. So what is managerial economics? So managerial economics, it's basically stemmed from most of the microeconomic foundation theories in order for us to have or apply the techniques that we learn in microeconomics to make decisions for the firm. The main focus for these decisions are usually to allocate efficiently for the resources available to the organizations, or maybe to respond to business problems and using some strategical techniques to pick the best solutions for the problems. So there are several things that we actually begin to think about solving a business problem with managerial economics concepts. Number one, we have to identify all the alternatives to a single problem. So it's often the case that the real-world problems will not only have one single solution, so we have to actually identify all of them possible. And two, select the choice that accomplishes the objectives in the most efficient manner. And by saying efficient manner, we basically weight the benefits and the cost to achieve those objectives. Number three, we're taking into account of the constraints. So every company or organizations are facing constraints in many different ways. It could be time, it could be human resources, sometimes it could be just simply capital. And number four, we also want to think about the likely actions and reactions of the rival decision makers. Well, it's often the case that companies are competing with other companies as well. So their rivals may actually react or respond to what you actually decide to do in the market. The several decision-making models that you can actually find in the economic literatures, which there are several of them that we actually cover in the textbook. For example, establish the objectives, identify the problems, examinations of potential solutions, analysis of the relative costs and benefits, sensitivity analysis, and implementations of the decisions. So those are the common elements that we actually consider or maybe take into account when we are making decisions for most of the economic problems for organizations to maximize their resources use. Generally speaking, responsibility of the managers can be broken down into the following categories. We're productively solving problem in the current business model. So it's often the case that we actually try to find solutions not when the problem happens, but we want to actually see what kinds of problem could happen and then provide solution ahead. Create organizational structure and culture based on the organization's missions. It's also important that we are making sure that every decision we make is actually fitting to our organization culture and missions. Establishing visions of new business directions and setting stretch goals to get there. So not only we are building solutions to the current problem, but we are also building solutions to build a longer path of the company. Coordinate the integrations of marketing, operations, and finance functions. We also have to make sure that our decisions making is actually integratable with cross multiple function teams in the company. Undertake the critical responsibility of motivating and monitoring teamwork. So there should be some sort of way that we can actually track the progress of our decisions solutions. Well, unfortunately, when solving a business problem as a manager or maybe a decision maker in organizations, it's not as easy as just a one email sent out to the organizations and have everyone comply. It's more than often case that when something actually gets into place, there will always be people who are actually taking it seriously, or maybe they are just more engaged to economic factors in those decision makings, whereas other people might not be as committed to distribute the work in place. So one of the most common issues that we have in the workplace, it's basically called moral hazards. So moral hazard basically describes when we are in a workplace, it's not guaranteed that everyone will put 110% effort to promote or to excel the company performance. Whereas some people might actually taking advantage of others to put out just 50% of their effort and assuming that it's a collective effort and the lack of commitments might not be important or maybe trackable within the organizations. So this kind of moral hazards issues actually happens a lot in our workplace. And as a manager or supervisor, of course, one of the most challenging thing is to basically provide solutions to tackle those kinds of moral hazard behavior from workers and help promoting a full commitment from workers and also maximizing the use of labor resources within organizations. Another important factors that most of the time we care about when we run in organizations or maybe a business is to track the economic profits. So generally speaking, the economic profits is defined by the difference between total sales revenues of a product to the total economic cost to produce that product. And of course, if you do have some um, economic foundations, you probably understand that the total economic cost here, it's not only covering the production costs, but also any opportunity costs that actually forfeit in order to commit to a single productions of a product or service. So in a free enterprise system, economic profits play an important roles guiding all these different decisions. So the existence of profits determines the types and quantity of goods or services that are produced and sold in the market, as well as resulting derived demands of resources for the productions. So several theories of profits actually indicates how this decision makings actually work. Some of these theories that you can actually find from the textbook readings includes the risk-bearing theory of profits. So profit is derived by the difference between cost and the revenues plus any risk of running the business. And the second concept here is called temporary disequilibrium theory of profits. So it's not always the case that the market is at equilibrium, but there are some times firms actually taking actions because they are have some intention to drive themselves away from the equilibriums, or maybe they are just not at the equilibrium and they have to make change of um, the revenues or maybe the price in order to get to the equilibriums faster. Monopoly theory of profits. So there's always a theory that actually demonstrates or explains how monopoly firms actually has this potential profits to earn. Innovation theory of profits, how innovations actually drive profits of the firm. And also managerial efficiency theory of profits, which describe how an entrepreneur with managerial efficiency maximizing the profits of the firm. When we're talking about profits, of course, sometimes it's very easy to think about a one-time dimensions. However, it would be actually more intuitive to think about maximizing profits of a firm. It's actually consider a multiple time periods aggregate sum. Particularly when we are thinking about the objective of the firms, maximizing profit is just one of the many different objectives that could possibly go into the decision making. As a shareholder of the company, if you're not a decision maker, but you're just a shareholder of a company, for example, you own a certain percentage stock of a company, but you're not making decisions for the company, you're just like having the assets within, it's very easy for you to believe that the firm objective is always trying to maximizing your wealth by owning this company. So the objective here, it's basically representing how the shareholder sometimes might demand the management to take certain actions to maximize their long-term benefits, which is the wealth, instead of the growth of the company, or maybe the current state of revenue of the company, or maybe other kinds of objectives that could probably be contradicting to this shareholder wealth maximization decisions. So in this example here, we are basically demonstrating how profits or maybe a wealth of a shareholder could be derived in a horizons of time. So again, the idea is basically having a true value of stocks calculated in different periods could be a better or maybe a more accurate way how shareholders think about their wealth, instead of just thinking about, oh, today's I owns maybe $200 worth of stock of Google, and that is my wealth of today. But you might actually consider how the value of the stock or the value of the company along the time horizons, and how it is counted with the inflations or maybe other discounted factors in the time periods. So we have also another issue derived from the previous discussions. As shareholder actually consider their objective is to maximizing their wealth, then there will always be some cases where the management level of the company has a discrepancy to what the shareholder actually wants to do with the company. And sometimes we actually call this a principal agent problems. So the principal agent problem basically describe how the agency conflict within the decision-making authorities. Sometimes because, well, the manager agents could be more or less care less about the profits earned of the company, but more towards to their own interest of how efficiently the company is run, how easy the job is, could be simplified, but not so much on like maximizing the wealth of the shareholder at a given point of time. So this kind of agency conflicts, it's basically creating a discrepancy of decision making and also controversial cases where sometimes the shareholder wants the management to take one actions, whereas the management disagree, or maybe trying to demonstrate why certain decisions could be bad for a company in the long runs. So to forge a closer alliance between the interests of the shareholder and the managers of the company, some company actually structure a larger portions of the manager compensations in the forms of performance-based payments. So that means, well, the better the company does, the higher paid of the share the management will get from that profits earned by the company. So in that case, the managers who are seeing their income tie with the performance of the company might actually have a more in line decision making with the shareholder as comparing to if their income is not related, right, to the performance of the company. So this is basically a very simple time series on the US data where we are demonstrating the aggregate CEO pay trends versus the corporate pay trends. So you can actually see in the most recent decades, most of the CEO compensations are really close to the corporate profits performance in the past 20 years. So talking about uh, private sector, it's actually relatively straightforward when we consider how we should decide on certain things, because most of the times it's profit driven. But on the other hand, when we are considering a public sectors or maybe a non-profit enterprise, the maximization rules will become a little bit different. Some of the characteristics that you can actually see from a public sector or maybe a non-profit sectors are including no one processes a right to receive profits or surplus in those enterprise, or maybe sometimes enterprise are exempt from tax on corporate incomes, and also donation to those enterprise are tax deductibles, which gives the enterprise an advantage when competing for capitals. So some of this characteristic, it's actually a good way of thinking about what's the advantage of running a non-profit organizations. But how are we going to allocate the resources within the enterprise will be a completely different problems. Are we actually doing a nature of goods and services to the society, or are we actually trying to get some objective achieved for the social perspective of the organizations? Or maybe we are having certain mission to serve from the beginnings. So those are the things that could drive very different decisions comparing to the private sectors running their enterprise with the profit maximizations objectives. Some of the objectives that you might be already have seen, for example, it could be something like maximizing the quantity and quality of outputs subject to the break-even budget constraints, or maybe to maximize the outcome preferred by that nonprofit organizations, or maybe sometime it could be just maximizing the nominative of the organization administrators. So all of this are not guaranteed to be the single objective. Sometimes it could be a multiple missions for the nonprofit to serve. And as a result, um, finding an objective functions or maybe a missions for those organizations, it's always the first thing to consider before we are trying to figure out how or what kind of strategies actually makes most sense to maximize the use of resources in those organizations or enterprise. So in some cases, nonprofit organization can also be um, put into some economic rules. For instance, we can actually consider the cost benefit analysis in running the nonprofit organizations or enterprise by simply just applying those three simple rules. For example, number one, we can actually try to maximizing the benefit for a given causes. So sometimes donations or maybe resources are constrained, and we can actually determine how much of those social benefits or maybe social services that we can generate from those given costs. On the other hand, we can also think about how we can minimize the cost to achieve certain types of missions level of targets. Um, for instance, if we are trying to provide a 1,000 meal per day to San Francisco homeless populations in the city, we can actually think about how much of the cost involved to get that missions complete, and minimizing the cost by improving efficiency for doing that. That could be another way to devote resources effectively or efficiently to achieve the goals. Well, on the other hand, of course, when costs or maybe resources are not uh, at the constraints, or maybe benefits is not clearly defined, sometimes we can also try to maximizing the nets between the two. So we can actually get the net benefits by using the benefits we generate in the society, subtracting the costs that involve to those missions or services that we are trying to provide to the society. So there are different ways of analyzing it, or maybe think about the problems. This is just some very simple cases, or maybe some very simple concepts that kind of give us an idea or directions how makers are making the decisions on a daily task. Um, but it's not limited to just applying these tools for either private or maybe public firms. So we are going to discuss more on the private sectors in the semester. However, some of these concepts that we discuss later in the semester are going to be widely applied to different sectors, including the nonprofits sector as well. So I think that's basically like a brief introduction to chapter one. There are some mathematical examples that it's provided in the chapter readings regarding the current values calculations. That might be the most challenging part to get through in chapter one. There are a couple of questions relate to that concept as well. So if you do have any questions, feel free to share your ideas, and I am more than happy to answer any questions in the class, um, especially on the discussion forums on iLearn. So for any questions, feel free to leave it to the discussion forum. If not, then I am hoping that this video is helping you to grab some of these concepts from chapter 1. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next lecture.